It's kind of easy to just walk past plants and not really think about them. Just, well, green stuff. But did you ever think about how, say, a bean sprout, even in pitch black darkness, knows exactly which way is up against gravity?
It's amazing, isn't it, that hidden complexity is everywhere in the plant world.
Totally. And that's why today we're grabbing this book, Botany for Dummies. We're hoping it can help us uncover some of these botanical secrets.
Yeah, this book, it's really great. It takes what seems like a pretty dense subject, botany, and it just breaks it down, makes it really understandable.
So think of this as like a shortcut for you listening. We're going deep, chapter by chapter, pulling out the core ideas, the key stuff.
Right, trying to make it stick without getting lost in all the super technical terms. We want to avoid the really heavy jargon if we can.
Consider it your botany boot camp. Maybe you're just curious about plants. Maybe you need a quick biology refresher, or, you just want a solid base of knowledge.
We're aiming to make it interesting, maybe even surprisingly fascinating.
We'll follow the book structure, Botany for Dummies, pretty closely. It starts with the basics, then moves through how plants work, how they reproduce, their amazing variety.
And even how we interact with them. Yeah, that logical flow is super helpful.
The book kicks off just explaining what botany is, then zooms right into the cell.
The microscopic world inside. And then how those cells build tissues. We'll follow that same path, chapter by chapter. Build up the picture.
So our mission today, pretty simple, really. Summarize the key info from each chapter of Botany for Dummies.
Yeah, give you a comprehensive but still digestible overview of the main concepts in botany as the book presents them.
Okay, let's dive in. Part 1, Plant Basics. Chapter 1, it sort of sets the scene. It's called Exploring Botany.
Right, and it's a great reminder that plants aren't just, background. They're absolutely fundamental for life on Earth. Easy to forget sometimes.
Totally. And what I found interesting right away is how it connects plants to, well, everything else alive.
Exactly. It points out plants, just like us, they're made of cells. Cells group into tissues, tissues form organs.
And it even mentions sexual reproduction in plants, which honestly isn't the first thing most people think about.
No, definitely not when you look at a flower, maybe. But the chapter stresses understanding plant structure, how they're built and function, how they work. That's really key to appreciating their role.
Yeah, their role in the environment and obviously as our food source. So fundamental.
Okay, so chapter 2 then zooms way in, down to the microscopic level, peering at plant cells.
Right, this is where we get the building blocks.
It starts right at the bottom with molecules, the basic stuff cells are made of, which are made of elements, atoms, isotopes.
Then it lays out some basic chemistry that's important for cells, like acids and bases, the pH scale.
Using everyday examples too, like rainwater, lemon juice, makes it relatable.
Yeah, it does this. So before we even get inside the cell, we get a feel for the chemical environment. Then it hits the 4 big types of molecules, the workhorses.
Exactly. First, carbohydrates, so sugars, starches. Think energy and structure.
Okay.
And then proteins, involved in pretty much everything a cell does. Just crucial.
Got it. Yeah.
Nucleic acids, DNA, and RNA. That's the information storage, the blueprints.
The instruction manual.
Right. And finally, lipids. Fats, oils, and phospholipids are key because they form membranes. It explains how being hydrophobic, water-repelling is so vital for those barriers.
And then we step inside. The cell interior. It's like a tiny city in there.
It really is. The chapter walks through the main parts, the organelles. You've got the plasma membrane, the gatekeeper controlling what comes in and out.
Okay.
DNA, the central library. Ribosomes, these little protein factories, just churning them out. And then because plant cells are eukaryotes, you get things like the endoplasmic reticulum, sort of the cell's post office, processing and shipping molecules.
Right.
The cytoskeleton, that's the internal scaffolding, gives it shape. Chloroplasts, the solar power plants doing photosynthesis.
Amazing.
And mitochondria, the powerhouses releasing energy through respiration.
And plants have some extras that animal cells don't, right?
Absolutely. The chapter specifically mentions the cell wall. That's that rigid outer layer giving strength and protection, like a suit of armor almost.
Okay.
And plasmodesmata, these tiny channels connecting adjacent cells. Think of it like the plant's internal communication network. Sharing stuff, sending signals.
That cell-to-cell connection seems super important for the whole plant.
Totally crucial. Which leads perfectly into chapter 3, identifying plant tissues. Now we see how these cells team up.
Groups of similar cells doing specific jobs.
Yeah, and the key concept here is meristems. These are like the plant's construction zones areas where cells are actively dividing. Growth happens here.
Oh, so that explains how they keep growing new bits.
Exactly. And from these meristems, the chapter outlines the 4 main tissue types.
Okay, what are they?
Well, first you have the meristematic tissue itself, the source of new cells. Then dermal tissue, that's the outer protective layer, like the epidermis, and it often has a cuticle, a waxy coat.
Like the plant's skin. Protects it from drying out, from pests.
Right, the first line of defense. Then there's ground tissue. This is kind of the bulk of the plant body, doing lots of different things.
Like what?
Storage, photosynthesis, support. It mentions different cell types within ground tissue. Parenchyma, which does storage and photosynthesis, like chlorenchyma, specialized for photosynthesis, or erenchyma with air spaces, useful for water plants.
Yeah.
Colangopema provides flexible support, like in the celery stalk. And sclerenchyma offers rigid support, think nutshells, that kind of hardness.
Right, okay, that makes sense. And the last type, vascular tissue.
Yes, the plant's plumbing system, essential for transport.
Moving water and food around.
Exactly. The chapter details xylem that moves water and minerals up from the roots, and phloem that transports the sugars made during photosynthesis down or up to where they're needed.
And it mentions the specific cells involved too, doesn't it?
It does. For xylem, things like tracheids and vessel elements. For phloem, sieve tube elements and their helper cells, the companion cells, it gives you the whole picture of the transport network.
Okay, wow. So Part I really lays the groundwork. Cells, tissues, the basic building blocks. Now, Part 2 gets into the living plant physiology, how it all works, starting with Chapter 4 on vegetative structures, stems, roots, and leaves.
Right. These 3 organs, stems, roots, leaves, they're the workhorses for growth and survival, getting resources, holding the plant up.
So stems for support and transport.
Roots for anchoring the plant and absorbing water and nutrients.
And leaves, obviously the main site for photosynthesis, making food.
Exactly. But it's not just what they do, it's how they're built inside. The book points out differences in stems, especially between monocots and dicots.
Yeah, I remember that from biology. What's the difference again?
So in monocots, think grasses, corn, the vascular bundles, those transport pipes are kind of scattered throughout the stem. Whereas in dicots like trees, beans, they're usually arranged in a neat ring. This creates distinct areas like the cortex towards the outside and the pith in the very center.
Got it. And the chapter also talks about growth, right? Primary and secondary.
Yes. Primary growth is lengthening, getting taller, roots growing longer. Secondary growth is thickening, getting wider. That's what happens in woody plants.
Making wood and bark.
Exactly. It involves specific meristematic tissues, the vascular cambium, which makes new xylem, wood, and phloem, inner bark, and the cork cambium, which makes the outer bark.
Okay. And roots aren't just simple anchors either, are they?
Yeah.
The book mentions specialized roots.
Oh, yeah. Fascinating stuff. It details the internal structure, the central vascular cylinder, the cortex, the epidermis, but then explores things like prop roots coming off the stem to brace the plant, like in corn, storage roots like carrots or sweet potatoes packed with food reserves, pneumatophores.
What are those again?
They're like snorkels, roots that grow upwards out of waterlogged soil, like in mangroves, to get oxygen. Aerial roots, like on some orchids, that absorb moisture from the air. And it also mentions mycorrhiza, those super important partnerships between roots and fungi.
Right, the fungi help the plant get nutrients. It's a symbiotic thing.
Exactly. Hugely beneficial. Then it moves on to leaves. Such incredible variety there.
Yeah, shape, sizes, how they're arranged.
This chapter covers the basic parts. The flat blade, the stalk or petiole connecting it to the stem, sometimes little stipules at the base. It explains simple leaves, one single blade, versus compound leaves.
Where the blade is divided into leaflets.
Right, like pinnate leaf compound, where leaflets are arranged along a central stalk like a feather, or palmate leaf compound, where they radiate out from one point like fingers on a hand.
Okay. And how they attach to the stem.
Different arrangements there, too.
Yeah.
Opposite leaves, directly across from each other. Alternate, staggered up the stem. Whorled, where several leaves arise from the same point in a circle. Or a basal rosette, clustered at the base like a dandelion.
And leaves can be modified too, right? Not just for photosynthesis.
Oh, absolutely. The book gives great examples. Tendrils for climbing, like in peas. Some leaves are reproductive, sprouting little plantlets along their edges. Scaly leaves protecting buds. Bulbs, like onions, are mostly modified leaves for storage.
Spines on a cactus. Those are modified leaves.
Yep. For defense and reducing water loss. Colorful bracts that look like petals, like on a poinsettia, to attract pollinators. And succulent leaves, like an aloe, specialized for storing water. It really shows how adaptable plants are.
It really does. Okay, so after the plant grows its stems, roots, and leaves, often the next step is making more plants. That brings us to Chapter 5, Seeds and Seedlings.
Yeah, this chapter focuses on how vital seeds are. For dispersal, getting offspring away from the parent plant, and for survival, waiting out bad conditions.
It breaks down the seed structure, doesn't it? Like a typical dicot seed.
It points out the protective seed coat on the outside. Inside, you have the embryo, which is the baby plant. It includes the cotyledons.
Those are the first sort of seed leaves?
Exactly. They often store food or help absorb it. Then the hypocotyl, the part of the embryonic stem below the cotyledons, the radicle, which will become the first root, the plumule, the embryonic shoot tip, and sometimes endosperm, which is a separate food supply.
Wow, a whole little package.
Yeah.
And germination, how it starts to grow.
The chapter walks through that. Usually the radicle, the root, emerges first, anchoring it and starting water absorption. Then the hypocotyl often elongates, pulling the cotyledons and plumule up out of the soil. Or sometimes the shoot grows up through the cotyledons.
The monocot seeds are a bit different.
Yeah, some key differences, like the coleoptile, a protective sheath around the young shoot as it pushes through the soil, and the coleorrhiza, protecting the young root. And often just one cotyledon, sometimes called a scutellum, that helps transfer food from the endosperm.
What makes a seed actually start growing? What triggers germination?
Good question. The chapter covers the main factors. Usually needs enough water, enough oxygen, the right temperature range, and some seeds actually need light to germinate while others need darkness.
Interesting. And the chapter connects seeds to fruits, right? Since fruits contain the seeds.
Absolutely. It explains that the fruit develops from the flower's ovary after fertilization, and its main job is to protect the seeds and often help disperse them.
But there are tons of different fruit types.
Oh, yeah. The book gives a great overview. It distinguishes between fleshy fruits like drupes, peaches, plums with a stony pit, berries, tomatoes, grapes, multiple seeds inside, pomes, apples, pears with a core,
right,
and dry fruits. Those can be ones that split open, like legumes, pea pods, bean pods, saliques, mustard pods, capsules, poppies,
okay,
or dry fruits that don't split open, like caryopsis, grains like corn or wheat where the fruit ball is fused to the seed coat, achenes, sunflower seeds with a loose seed inside, summaries, winged fruits like maples, schizocarps, like carrots that break into single-seeded parts, and nuts, like acorns or hazelnuts with a hard shell.
That is a lot of variety. So how do all these seeds get around? Dispersal.
The chapter wraps up with that. Fascinating strategies. Wind dispersal for light seeds or winged seeds. Animal dispersal, animals eat fleshy fruits and poop out the seeds elsewhere, or seeds hitch a ride on fur. Water dispersal for buoyant seeds, and even mechanical dispersal where the plant physically throws its seeds.
Like bursting pods.
Exactly. Really clever ways plants have evolved to spread out.
Okay, so we have structures, we have new plants starting from seeds. Chapter 6 gets into the real engine room. Metabolism, how living things get energy and matter.
Yeah, metabolism is basically the sum total of all the chemical reactions happening inside the plant to keep it alive. It breaks it down into two main types. Anabolism?
Building things up.
Right, constructing complex molecules, like making proteins or DNA. And catabolism.
Breaking things down.
Exactly, breaking down molecules like sugars to release energy. And a key point here is that plants are autotrophs.
Meaning they make their own food, using sunlight photosynthesis.
Unlike heterotrophs, like us, who have to eat other organisms to get energy.
And all these reactions, they happen in specific sequences, right? Metabolic pathways.
Yes. The chapter describes pathways. Some are linear, some are cyclic, some branch off. And crucially, these reactions don't just happen on their own. They need help.
Enzymes.
Enzymes. Biological catalysts, usually proteins that speed up specific reactions without being changed themselves. Absolutely essential.
The chapter also introduces ATP, right? The energy currency.
Yes, ATP adenosine triphosphate. Think of it as the cell's rechargeable battery. Energy released from catabolism, like breaking down sugar, is stored in ATP. Then ATP provides the energy for anabolic reactions, like building proteins and other cell work. It explains the ATP-ADP cycle, how it gets charged and discharged.
That's a really helpful analogy, the battery. What about electron carriers?
Also, key players in energy transfer. It introduces NAD plus NADP plus FAD. These molecules shuttle high-energy electrons around during processes like photosynthesis and respiration. It explains redox reactions. Oxidation is loss of electrons. Reduction is gain. Oil rig. These coupled reactions are fundamental to energy flow.
Okay. And plants also need basic building materials, nutrients from the soil.
Definitely. The chapter briefly covers essential nutrients. Macronutrients, needed in larger amounts, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, calcium, magnesium.
The NPK you see on fertilizer bags.
Exactly. And micronutrients, needed in tiny amounts, but still vital iron, manganese, boron, copper, zinc, molybdenum, chlorine.
And finally, pigments for capturing light.
Right. Molecules like chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B, which absorb red and blue light and reflect green, why plants look green. Also, carotenoids, yellows, oranges, and phycobilins in some algae and cyanobacteria. These capture the light energy that drives photosynthesis.
Which leads us perfectly into Chapter 7, photosynthesis, gathering light and making sugar. Probably the most famous plant process.
Arguably the most important biological process on Earth, period. It provides the food and oxygen for almost all life.
The chapter gives the overall equation, doesn't it?
Yep. Carbon dioxide plus water using light energy yields glucose, sugar, and oxygen. CO2 plus H2O plus light nethery C6H12O6 plus O2, and it all happens inside the chloroplasts.
Those tiny solar-powered sugar factories we mentioned earlier.
Exactly. And the process has two main stages.
Light-dependent reactions and light-independent reactions.
Correct. The light-dependent reactions happen in the thylakoid membranes within the chloroplast. This is where light energy is actually captured by pigments in structures called photosystems. That energy is used to split water, release oxygen, and generate ATP and NADPH, the energy currency and electron carrier needed for the next stage. It involves electron transport chains.
Kind of like a microscopic bucket brigade passing energy along.
That's a decent analogy, yeah. Passing electrons down a chain, releasing energy that's used to make ATP and NADPH. It mentions both non-cyclic and cyclic pathways for this.
Okay, so that's stage 1. Capture light energy, make chemical energy. What's stage 2?
Stage 2 is the light-independent reactions, also called the Calvin cycle. This happens in the stroma, the fluid-filled space around the thylakoids.
And this uses the ATP and NADPH from stage 1?
Precisely. The Calvin cycle uses that chemical energy to take CO2 from the air and fix it, incorporating it into organic molecules, ultimately producing glucose, sugar. It's a cycle because the starting molecule, RoBP, is regenerated at the end. The key enzyme here is Rubisco, which grabs the CO2.
So that's how they actually make the sugar. Does it always work perfectly?
Not always. The chapter mentions photorespiration. Sometimes Rubisco grabs oxygen instead of CO2, which is wasteful for the plant. But it also introduces adaptations some plants have, especially in hot, dry climates, to overcome this. C4 photosynthesis and CAM photosynthesis, they have ways to concentrate CO2 around Rubisco, making photosynthesis more efficient under tough conditions.
Clever adaptations. Okay, so plants make their own sugar fuel, but they still need to use that fuel, release the energy. That's Chapter 8. Cellular respiration, making your cake and eating it too.
Huh, yeah, good title. Respiration is how plants and animals and fungi, most living things, break down sugars, like glucose, to release the stored chemical energy in a form the cell can use, ATP.
It's kind of the reverse of photosynthesis in a way.
In terms of the overall equation, yes. Glucose plus oxygen yields carbon dioxide, water, and energy, ATP. C6H12O6 plus O2, my CO2 plus H2O plus energy. But the process is very different.
It also happens in steps.
Yes. 3 main stages for aerobic respiration, meaning it uses oxygen. First is glycolysis. This happens out in the cytoplasm. Glucose gets split into 2 molecules of pyruvate. You get a small net gain of ATP and some NADH.
Okay, step 1, split glucose in the cytoplasm. Then what?
Then, if oxygen is available, the pyruvate moves into the mitochondria. Stage 2 is the Krebs cycle, or citric acid cycle. This happens in the mitochondrial matrix, the inner space.
What happens in the Krebs cycle?
Pyruvate is further broken down, releasing CO2. More importantly, it generates a bit more ATP, but mainly loads up more electron carriers, lots of NADH and some FADH too.
So collecting high-energy electrons.
Yeah.
And the final stage uses those.
Exactly. Stage 3 is the electron transport chain and oxidative phosphorylation. This happens across the inner mitochondrial membrane. The NADH and FADH2 drop off their high-energy electrons to the chain.
Like the one in photosynthesis.
Similar idea, yeah. As electrons move down the chain, energy is released and used to pump protons across the membrane, creating a gradient. Then, as protons flow back across through an enzyme called ATP synthase, it generates a lot of ATP. This is where the big energy payoff happens. Oxygen is the final electron acceptor at the end of the chain, forming water.
Wow, okay, so that's how they get most of their energy. What if there's no oxygen?
Good question. The chapter briefly covers anaerobic respiration or fermentation. If there's no oxygen, glycolysis still happens, but the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain can't run. So the cell uses fermentation pathways to regenerate NAD+, so glycolysis can continue.
Okay.
It produces much, much less ATP and makes byproducts like ethanol in yeast and plants sometimes, or lactic acid in animals.
Right, okay. So much less efficient without oxygen. Now, plants are doing all this, taking in water and nutrients, making sugars, using energy. How do they move everything around? That's Chapter 9, moving materials through plants.
Yeah, transport is crucial. Getting water from roots to leaves, sugars from leaves to roots or fruits. It starts with the basics of how stuff crosses cell membranes.
Like diffusion.
Right. Diffusion, just moving down a concentration gradient. Assimilated diffusion, still passive, but needs a helper protein. Active transport, which uses energy, usually ATP, to move substances against their gradient.
Okay.
And osmosis, specifically the movement of water across a semi-permeable membrane. It's affected by solute concentration and pressure. This leads to concepts like turgor pressure.
That's what keeps plant cells firm, right? Like crisp lettuce.
Exactly. Water pressure pushing out against the cell wall. And plasmolysis, which is when a cell loses too much water in a salty environment and the membrane pulls away from the wall. The plant wilts.
Got it. So how does water get from the soil all the way up a tall tree? That seems like a huge feat.
It is. The main explanation is the transpiration cohesion tension theory.
Okay, break that down.
So transpiration is water evaporating from the leaves, mostly through tiny pores called stomata. This creates a negative pressure like suction, pulling water up the xylem.
Okay.
Cohesion is water molecules sticking to each other because of hydrogen bonds. Adhesion is water sticking to the walls of the xylem tubes. Together, these create continuous columns of water from roots to leaves, pulled up by the tension from transpiration.
Like drinking through a very, very long straw.
Pretty much. The chapter also mentions root pressure. Sometimes roots actively pump ions in, drawing water in and pushing it up slightly. And guttation, where you see water droplets on leaf edges caused by root pressure. And cavitation, which is when air bubbles form and break the water column, which can be a problem.
Okay, that covers water. What about the sugars made in the leaves? How do they get everywhere else?
That happens in the phloem, and it's explained by the pressure flow hypothesis. It's about sources and sinks.
A source is where sugar is made or stored, like a leaf.
Exactly. And a sink is where sugar is needed, like growing roots, fruits, or storage organs.
So how does it flow?
At the source, sugars are actively loaded into the phloem sieve tubes. This makes the phloem sap really concentrated, so water flows in from the xylem via osmosis. This builds up high pressure at the source.
Okay.
At the sink, sugars are actively unloaded and used or stored. This makes the sap less concentrated, water leaves the phloem, and the pressure drops.
Ah, so the pressure difference pushes the sugary sap from high pressure source to low pressure sink.
That's the idea. A bulk flow driven by pressure gradients generated by loading and unloading sugars.
Clever system.
Ah.
All right, final chapter in part 2, chapter 10, is about regulating plant growth and development. Plants don't just grow randomly. It's controlled.
Very controlled. This chapter introduces plant hormones or phytohormones. These are chemical signals that coordinate almost everything a plant does: growth, flowering, stress responses.
And there are a few major types.
Yep, the book covers the main ones. First, auxins.
I think I remember those are involved in growth, like stem elongation.
Primarily, yes. Cell elongation in shoots. Also, apical dominance, the main bud-suppressing side buds, root development too. And they're key for tropism's responses to stimuli like light, phototropism, and gravity, gravitropism.
Okay. Then cytokinins, cell division.
Spot on. Cytokinins promote cell division. They also work with auxins to influence things like lateral bud growth and can delay senescence, the aging of leaves.
Got it. Gibberellins, what do they do?
Gibberellins are famous for promoting stem elongation, think dramatically taller plants. Also important for seed germination, flowering in some species, and fruit development.
Okay. Abscisic acid, ABA.
Yeah.
Sounds like stopping things.
It often acts as an inhibitor, yeah.
Yeah.
ABA promotes dormancy in seeds and buds, helping plants survive harsh conditions. And crucially, it triggers stomata closure during drought stress to conserve water.
The stress hormone. And finally, ethylene, fruit ripening.
That's its best-known role. Ethylene gas triggers ripening in many fruits, like bananas and tomatoes. It's also involved in leaf abscission, shedding leaves, and responses to stress.
Wow, just a few chemicals controlling so much. Are hormones the only thing?
No, the chapter points out other signals too and emphasizes environmental cues: light, gravity, touch, temperature. They all influence how a plant grows and develops.
Like flowering only when the days are the right length.
Exactly. That's photoperiodism. The plant measures day or night length. This involves a light-detecting pigment called phytochrome. The chapter also touches on other plant movements like rapid turgor movements, think Venus flytrap closing, and slower growth movements.
Okay, part 2 really showed how dynamic plants are. Photosynthesis, respiration, transport, hormones.
Yeah.
It's a busy life. This seems like a good spot to pause. We've covered the basics and the physiology from the first half of Botany for Dummies.
Absolutely. We've got the building blocks and the machinery. Next up, when we return, we'll tackle part 3, how plants make more plants' reproduction and genetics.
Great. We'll dive into plant reproduction and how traits get passed down right after this.